president of the UFC, the commander and chief, Dana White, is not a hard man to piss off. In fact, he's been known to go on tirades bashing everyone from network CEOs to boxers. But what happens when one of his own events goes off the rails? From a referee who allowed a bloodbath to take place to a performance that was so dull that it put the audience to sleep, these are the fights that enraged Dana White. In an MMA bout, it's the referee's job to make sure that fighters are safe. Sometimes the toughest mixed martial artists will fight through some horrible injuries just to secure a win. Fight fans admire their toughness, but even we don't want to see a fighter get massacred, and neither does Dana White. At UFC Fight Night 125, that's exactly what happened, and the president of the UFC was none too happy about it. Valentina Shevchenko was set to face Prriscila Cachoeira, fighting in the newly created division at 125 pounds. Valentina was a huge favorite going into the fight, a veteran with some awesome highlights and her eye on the newly created 125 belt. The same can't be said of Prriscila. Sure, she had an unbeaten record, but against mid-level competition at best. And as soon as the bell rang and the two fighters advanced, it became obvious how the fight would go. Prriscila ate a savage blow to the face early in, and Valentina proceeded to put the beat on her like her life depended on it. By the end of the first round, there was a lot of blood and a lot of questioning looks directed to the ref, Mario Yamasaki. Prriscila came out to the second round still gunning, but this round went much like the first. Only now, everyone watching was wondering why Yamasaki just didn't stop the fight. Valentina submitted her opponent, and the fight was over. But a lot of fans questioned whether the brutal beatdown should have gone on for as long as it did, and Dana White was thinking the same thing. After the fight, Dana tweeted out apologizing to Prriscila, saying that it was the ref's job to keep the fighters safe and blasting Yamasaki for failing to do so. He branded it a disgusting performance on Mario's part, adding that it wasn't the first time he'd put fighters in danger. He finished off by saying he hoped Yamasaki was fired, but the decision was ultimately out of his hands. Luckily for Mario, that much was true. White would have probably fired him on the spot if he could. Now, it seems like a fight doesn't even have to go down in the UFC for Dana to be pissed off at a bad referee. Just take the World Series of Fighting 3. John Fitch was set to face Josh Burkman in a bout refereed by Steve Mazzagatti. White had already had issues with Mazzagatti before, branding him the worst ref in the history of any fight business. And that night, Steve might have proved him right. When the fight began, Fitch came out aggressive, but Burkman quickly dropped the former UFC contender to his knees. John went for a takedown and slipped into a brutal guillotine choke. Usually around this time in a fight, a referee will be close to the fighters, watching closely to make sure no one gets hurt and the choke is released. But Steve, his head was in the clouds. John's arm went limp, and when Josh realized his opponent was unconscious, he let go and got up to celebrate. Mazzagatti may as well not have been there. After the fight, Dana White wasted no words blasting Mazzagatti in a 10-minute tirade to the press, calling him a toolbox, and even mocking the ref's internal monologue. It seems like bad refereeing really pisses Dana off, cause he went full scorched earth on Steve. It's not just subpar referees that get under the UFC president's skin. Oh no, causing a massive brawl at the largest UFC pay-per-view event in history is bound to rub him up the wrong way. At UFC 229, MMA superstars Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov fought in arguably the most highly anticipated MMA bout of all time. The build-up to the event was intense, and things had gotten personally heated between the two fighters. After Khabib managed to submit Conor in the fourth round, it seems he hadn't had enough excitement for the night. The Dagestani proceeded to jump the cage and attack McGregor's trainer, and as any fight fans know, chaos ensued. Members of Khabib's team jumped into the octagon and attacked McGregor, and in the following havoc, the event was cut short without a post-fight announcement. Understandably, Dana wasn't too happy about how things played out that night. Speaking to Fox Sports, he said, "I'm disgusted and sick over it." Not the kind of comments you want the president of the company making about you, that's for sure. Sure, sometimes it's a dangerous melee that sets Dana off. Other times, it can be something as simple as a pair of Speedos. At UFC 133 in Philadelphia, MMA vet and UFC welterweight Dennis Hallman was set to face Brian Ebersole. Usually, fighters wear shorts when they step into the octagon, but this time around, Dennis opted for some tight, bright blue Speedos. Speaking with Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour, Hallman explained the Speedos were part of a lost bet, but refused to mention what the bet was about. His unusual choice of clothing didn't do him any favors that night, as Hallman ended up being ground and pounded to defeat by Brian, all within the first round. During their scuffle, Hallman's family jewels were briefly exposed for the hundreds of thousands of fans watching, and after the bout, Dana White was not too happy about those Speedos. He was quoted as saying, "I've never been so embarrassed being in the UFC." He also gave Ebersole a $70,000 bonus for getting Dennis out of there as quickly as possible. Hallman didn't understand what the big fuss was about, but in that bout, he unwittingly contributed to the UFC rules being changed, and a fighter dress code has been instituted. Now, if there's one fight in the history of the UFC that has infuriated Dana White beyond belief, it's got to be the bout between Anderson Silva and Demian Maia at UFC 112 in Abu Dhabi. The most frustrating thing about this terrible fight is that it could have all been avoided. At the time, Silva was the UFC's middleweight champion, considered by some to the best fighter pound for pound in the world, and to this day, one of the UFC's all-time greats. His main event bout with Maia should have been electric and entertaining, but instead it turned out to be a huge disappointment. Silva came out cocky, spending most of the first couple rounds showboating, but as the fight progressed, he refused to engage with his opponent, and the whole bout turned into a game of tag rather than a fight. Why was the world's supposedly greatest fighter putting all his fans to sleep? As the main event crumbled before his eyes, Dana could barely contain his embarrassment, and the president of the company left his cage-side seat well before the fight finished and the winner was announced. At the post-fight press conference, White blasted Silva for his terrible performance and apologized to the fans, saying, "To end it the way we did was an embarrassment for me, the frittatas, the UFC, and the sport in general." He added that he was disgusted and saddened, and that the failed main event made him sick to his stomach. I just wonder how the next conversation between Anderson and him went down. I'm sure it wasn't too favorable for the Brazilian fighter. All in all, Dana White isn't exactly known for keeping a cool head. The UFC's president has a penchant for going off on reporters, fighters, and anybody who gets in his bad books. But as you've seen, sometimes the boss's anger is justified, especially when a terrible fight could have been avoided. So from a referee who allowed a bloodbath to take place to a performance that was so dull that it put the audience to sleep, those were the fights that enraged Dana White.